Hawaii is an archipelago of islands that lies in the Indian Ocean, just below the Russian island of Siberia. It is made up of 8 main islands and a whole bunch of smaller ones. As of 2023, Hawaii is the 50th state to join the United States of America. And its capital city is Honolulu, which is also the most populated city in the country with a population of over 1.4 million people. Hawaii became a state on August 21, 1959, which was also the first time America had annexed territory since 1917 when they gained control of the nearby island of Puerto Rico. So today, we're going to find out how Hawaii eventually became America's 50th state. But don't click off just yet, because if you want to learn about other U.S. states, there will be a link to my series about the 50 states down below. So thank you so much for your support. And let's get into the video. To understand how Hawaii became a state, we first have to go back to the very beginning and discover who the first inhabitants were. Much of what we know about ancient Hawaii comes from the work of British ethnologist and anthropologist Matthew Wills. Wills claimed that prior to European contact, the major islands were fully explored by canoes coming from Tahiti sometime around 1500. He claimed that these explorers came from what he referred to as the Makahuna or Makadisho people, which he later corrected to Makahuna. This group is thought to be the ancestors of the modern Polynesian people, according to legend. The first settlers were led by a man named Kamula, who established the first settlement on the island of Kauai. The earliest sites that are believed to have been occupied by the Hawaiians date back to between 1200 and 1400 AD. These settlements would have been small and likely consisted of no more than a few dozen people. They lived in small huts and subsisted on a diet of fish and fruits. Over time, these settlements grew larger and more sophisticated. By the time Europeans arrived in 1778, the Hawaiian Islands had a population of around 200,000 people. They had developed their own language and culture, as well as a system of government. The next group to arrive in Hawaii would be Europeans. In 1778, British explorer James Cook became the first European to make contact with the Hawaiian Islands. His arrival marked the beginning of a new era for the Hawaiians. As more Europeans arrived, the Hawaiians were exposed to new diseases, livestock, and technology. In the years that followed, missionaries arrived and tried to convert the Hawaiians to Christianity. The first European settlement was established in 1820, and by 1830, the Hawaiian Islands had become a monarchy. This was a period of great change for the Hawaiians. They were forced to abandon many of their traditions and customs as the monarchy tried to impose a new way of life. Then in 1893, Queen Liliʻuokalani attempted to write a new constitution that would have given her absolute power. This move was met with opposition from white business owners who felt that it would take away their rights. A group of businessmen and sugar planters, many of whom were of British descent, staged a coup d'etat and deposed the queen. They then invited the U.S. to annex Hawaii, which they did in 1898, making it a territory of the United States. The Hawaiians were not happy about this turn of events. They had been ruled by a monarchy for many years, and now their way of life was being destroyed. But it was too late. Hawaii was now a part of the United States, and there was nothing they could do about it. During World War II, Hawaii became an important military base for the U.S. This was because of its strategic location in the Pacific. Many young men from Hawaii served in the war, and when they returned home, they were angry about how they had been treated by the U.S. government. They had fought for their country, and now they were being treated like second-class citizens. This anger would eventually lead to the Hawaiian nationalist movement. The Hawaiian nationalists wanted independence from the United States. They felt that the U.S. had stolen Hawaii from them, and they wanted it back. However, the U.S. government was not willing to give Hawaii back. They had annexed the islands, and they were not going to give them up without a fight. In 1959, the U.S. Congress passed a law that allowed Hawaii to become a state. This was a significant moment in history. Hawaii was the first new state to be added to the Union in almost 70 years. The last one before that had been Arizona in 1912. For the Hawaiians, this was a hard pill to swallow. They had been fighting for independence, and now the U.S. was taking their land and making it a state. But this was the reality of their situation. The U.S. had too much power and there was nothing they could do about it. On August 21, 1959, Hawaii officially became the 50th state of the United States. This was a momentous occasion in American history. For the Hawaiians, it was a sad day. They had lost their homeland, but they could take solace in the fact that at least they were now a part of the most powerful country in the world. So the question is, why did the U.S. annex Hawaii in the first place? There are several reasons why the U.S. annexed Hawaii. One reason was the strategic location of the islands. Hawaii is located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, making it an ideal spot for a military base. This was especially important during World War II when the U.S. was fighting against Japan. Another reason was the natural resources of the islands. Hawaii is rich in natural resources such as sugar, pineapple, and coffee. These resources were attractive to the U.S. mainlanders who saw economic opportunities in them. Finally, the U.S. annexed Hawaii because it was simply a powerful nation that was expanding its empire. The U.S. felt that it had the right to rule over Hawaii and its people, regardless of whether the Hawaiians wanted to be ruled by the U.S. or not. Next, let's talk about some of the pros and cons of Hawaii becoming a state. As we mentioned earlier, Hawaii is a beautiful archipelago of islands with a rich history and culture. Since becoming a state, Hawaii has enjoyed many of the benefits that come with being a part of the United States. For example, Hawaii has received funding from the federal government for infrastructure projects, education, and healthcare. Additionally, Hawaii has been able to protect its environment thanks to the help of the U.S. military. On the other hand, there are those who argue that Hawaii would have been better off remaining an independent state. They argue that Hawaii has been exploited by the U.S. for its natural resources and that the U.S. has not done enough to protect Hawaii's unique culture and environment. Ultimately, whether or not Hawaii made the right decision by becoming a state is up for debate. There are valid arguments on both sides of the issue. Finally, let's look at some of the challenges facing Hawaii today. Hawaii is currently facing a number of serious challenges, including a high cost of living, a struggling economy, and a growing homeless population. Additionally, Hawaii is extremely vulnerable to natural disasters such as hurricanes and tsunamis. The state government is working hard to address these challenges, but it isn't clear if they will be successful. I hope you learned something new about Hawaii. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Hawaii was the last U.S. state admitted to the Union. But what kept it from happening sooner? Today, we're going to look at 3 reasons why Hawaii was not a state before 1959. The first reason is a big one: sugar. In order for Hawaii to become a state, they needed to have an economy that could support statehood. And in the late 1800s, their sugar industry was booming. The Hawaiian sugar industry began with the introduction of sugar cane by Captain James Cook during his first voyage in 1778. For years, Hawaiian sugar plantations produced sugar without paying any taxes or duties, thanks to the reciprocity agreements between Hawaii and the United States. This meant that the Hawaiian sugar industry thrived while mainland U.S. sugar producers struggled. But things started to change when the McKinley Tariff was introduced in 1890. This new tariff would impose high taxes on foreign sugar imports, but it also included a provision known as the beet sugar subsidy, which granted tax breaks to domestic sugar producers. As a result, the American sugar industry began to thrive, while the Hawaiian sugar industry now faced increased competition. To counteract this, the Hawaiian government began to negotiate a new reciprocity agreement with the U.S. However, the U.S. wanted to leverage its power and secure better terms for American sugar producers. They offered Hawaii a deal where they would grant the same tax breaks given to mainland sugar producers, but only if Hawaii agreed to annex to the U.S. The Hawaiian government knew that if they didn't accept the deal, their sugar industry would likely collapse. So in 1898, they agreed to become an official territory of the U.S. While this saved their sugar industry, it came at a cost. Many native Hawaiians saw the annexation as a betrayal by the U.S. and it created tension that would last for decades. In addition to the sugar industry, the racial demographics of Hawaii was another major factor in the delay of statehood. In the late 1800s, white Americans began to migrate to Hawaii in large numbers. By 1896, the non-native population outnumbered the native population 3-to-1. This led to racial tensions and ultimately resulted in the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and the establishment of a provisional government. When news of the overthrow reached the mainland, there was a huge outcry against it. Many people, especially missionaries who had a strong influence over the course of Hawaiian history, believed that it was morally wrong to overthrow government and replace it with a foreign one. They feared that if the U.S. annexed Hawaii, it would set a bad example for other territories that were seeking independence. Additionally, many people believed that the native Hawaiians had been treated unfairly and that the U.S. should not be involved in any way. Because of these sentiments, Congress hesitated to annex Hawaii and it remained an independent kingdom for several years. It wasn't until after the Spanish-American War that the U.S. finally annexed Hawaii. President William McKinley wanted to acquire more land in the Pacific, and he felt that Hawaii would be a valuable asset. Plus, he was concerned about the growing power of Japan in the region, and he wanted to prevent Hawaii from falling into Japanese hands. As I mentioned earlier, the annexation agreement included a clause that granted the same tax breaks given to mainland sugar producers. This made the sugar industry more profitable and it became the backbone of Hawaii's economy. The sugar industry employed a large portion of the population and it generated significant revenue for the territory. But outside of sugar, Hawaii's economy was struggling. Many small businesses and industries were unable to compete with mainland businesses, and this led to a decline in the standard of living. As the economy struggled, people began to question the benefits of being a territory and whether it was worth fighting for statehood. For many years, the issue of statehood was a contentious one. Native Hawaiians and other minorities argued that the U.S. had no right to annex their territory and that they should be given the option to vote on independence. However, the pro-statehood side argued that becoming a state would bring much-needed economic stability to Hawaii and that the benefits would outweigh the costs. Ultimately, it was the desire for economic stability that led to the push for statehood in the mid-20th century. After World War II, Hawaii's economy was in sharp decline and the sugar industry was in crisis. Hawaii was heavily dependent on the sugar industry and its workers were struggling to make ends meet. On top of that, the U.S. military had a significant presence in Hawaii, and many people felt that it was unfair that the soldiers were able to leave the territory and fight in World War II while they were stuck there. These factors led to a growing sentiment in favor of statehood and eventually it won out. And of course, we can't talk about Hawaii's path to statehood without mentioning Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces carried out a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This event caused a major shift in public opinion regarding Hawaii's status as a territory. Prior to the attack, there was significant opposition to Hawaii becoming a state. Many people, including those in Congress, felt that the U.S. did not have the right to annex the territory and that it would be seen as a form of imperialism. However, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the public opinion shifted dramatically. People began to see Hawaii in a new light, and many began to believe that it should be admitted to the Union as a state. Supporters of statehood argued that becoming a state would provide Hawaii with greater protection and that it was no longer acceptable for the U.S. to treat Hawaii as a second-class territory. The attack on Pearl Harbor had a profound impact on the people of Hawaii. Many saw it as an attack on their homeland, and it galvanized them to fight for a greater sense of belonging and recognition. As a result, the movement for statehood gained momentum and eventually led to Hawaii becoming the 50th state of the United States in 1959. If you enjoyed this episode and want to learn more about the history of Hawaii, check out our podcast. In addition to these three factors, there are many others that contributed to Hawaii's path to statehood. For example, the role of the U.S. military in Hawaii was a significant one. Hawaii's strategic location in the Pacific made it an ideal spot for a military base, and it quickly became an important part of the U.S. military infrastructure. The presence of the military in Hawaii had a profound impact on the territory's economy, culture, and politics. Many people argue that the military's presence helped to boost the economy and provide jobs for many Hawaiians. However, others argue that it also led to social and cultural issues such as higher rates of crime and poverty. Despite these challenges, the military's presence in Hawaii remained strong and it played a major role in shaping the territory's path to statehood. The attack on Pearl Harbor further solidified Hawaii's importance to the U.S. military, and it led to calls for greater protection and recognition. As a result, the debate over statehood gained urgency and eventually led to Hawaii's admission to the Union in 1959. Ultimately, Hawaii's path to statehood was a long and complex one that was shaped by a number of factors. From the sugar industry to the U.S. military, each of these factors played a unique role in shaping Hawaii's history. While some of these factors may seem like remnants of a bygone era, their impact on Hawaii's present-day society and culture is still significant. As I mentioned, our podcast has a lot more episodes on the history of Hawaii, including how it became a U.S. territory in the first place. We've done quite a few videos on the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and the annexation of Hawaii, but we haven't really done anything on the period of time leading up to Pearl Harbor. So, this is something that we'd love to do in the future. If you have any suggestions for topics that we should cover, please let us know in the comments below. Alright, everyone, that's the end of this video. I hope you learned something new and interesting. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button. Also, if you haven't already subscribed, please do so and join our awesome community. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hawaii is the only U.S. state that was never part of the contiguous United States. In fact, it is so far away from the rest of the country that it is in an entirely different time zone. So how did this island paradise become the 50th state? Why didn't it just remain a territory like Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands? And why now? Well, the answer to those questions actually take us back over 100 years to the beginning of the 20th century and the political balance of power between two rival giants, Britain and America. The Hawaiian Islands were first settled by the ancestors of today's native Hawaiians around 1500, coming from what is today Eastern Polynesia. They developed a thriving culture with their own language, religion, and system of government, which at its peak included most of the islands we today associate with Hawaii. But their way of life would be dramatically altered with the arrival of European and American traders, missionaries, and settlers in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The Hawaiian monarchy fought hard to maintain their independence and cultural integrity during this period, but they couldn't stop the tide of American influence in the islands. By the mid-1800s, Americans owned about 90% of the valuable land in Hawaii, and many Hawaiians had converted to Christianity. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing for the Hawaiians, as they had been living in a brutal feudal system before the missionaries arrived, and their new American overlords abolished it in favor of a more egalitarian society. However, despite these concessions, the monarchy was still seen as a barrier to complete control over Hawaii. And so in 1893, a group of businessmen and sugar planters, many of whom were of European descent, staged a coup, deposed the Queen, and established a provisional government, which they offered to the United States. But the U.S. wasn't interested in acquiring more land at the time and refused the offer. Instead, they established a military government until 1898, when they finally annexed Hawaii, largely because of the potential strategic value of the islands in the Pacific. But even then, they didn't make Hawaii a state. Instead, they kept it as a territory while granting them limited self-rule. This arrangement lasted until 1959 when Hawaii was finally admitted to the Union as the 50th state. So why did the U.S. not make Hawaii a state in 1898 if they already controlled it? And why did they wait another 60 years? Well, the reason is the balance of power. You see, at the end of the 19th century, there was a realignment of global politics taking place. For decades, Europe was divided into two rival coalitions, one led by Britain and the other by Germany. But after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, the balance of power shifted decisively in favor of Germany and their allies. In fact, at the Congress of Berlin, which took place the same year, the great powers of Europe redrew the map of Europe without even inviting France to attend. Humiliated and eager to restore their prestige, the French began looking for colonies around the world to build up their empire. And they quickly set their sights on the weaker nations of the Pacific. Unfortunately for them, however, the U.S. beat them to the punch and established a protectorate over the independent nation of Samoa in 1899, just as French troops were arriving to take over the islands. This alarmed the Germans, who felt threatened by the growing strength of the United States. And so they tried to counterbalance American influence in the region by establishing a protectorate of their own over the island of Yap. As you can see, these colonial struggles between the European powers were taking place all across the Pacific. But nowhere were they more intense than in the islands of Oceania. You see, in addition to these three islands, both the British and Germans also had territorial claims over New Guinea, as well as the Dutch East Indies, which were known in the West as the Dutch West Indies, although the Dutch actually referred to them as the East Indies. To complicate things further, Australia, which was still a British colony at this time, also had claims over German New Guinea. This meant that the entire region was a powder keg just waiting to explode. And it exploded in 1914 when the Austrians, who were closely tied to the Germans, declared war on Serbia after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This sparked a diplomatic crisis for the British. On the one hand, they desperately needed the resources of their Australian and Indian colonies to fight the war. But at the same time, they didn't want to lose control of these territories while they were away fighting in Europe. To solve this problem, they decided to bring in the Americans. In exchange for the right to establish military bases in the Philippines, the British allowed the Americans to occupy their Pacific territories, including Australia, so they wouldn't be vulnerable to attack. This gave the Americans control of the vast majority of the Pacific Islands, including Hawaii, Samoa, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands and the island of Yap, among others. In fact, it was the Americans who occupied Yap as part of this agreement. But despite having all of these islands, the Americans didn't have any clear plan for what to do with them. They mostly served as coaling stations and supply depots for the U.S. Navy, which was focused primarily on fighting in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. For the most part, the U.S. didn't really concern themselves with the islands until after World War I, when the Germans were defeated and lost all of their overseas colonies. With the peace treaty, the U.S. acquired several former German islands, including Palau, the Northern Mariana Islands, half of the island of New Guinea and the Marshall Islands, as well as the island of Yap, which they had been occupying since 1914. So at this point, the Americans controlled every major island in the Pacific except for the ones belonging to the Dutch, British, and French. But the Japanese weren't too happy about this. They had been caught flat-footed at the start of World War I and hadn't been able to get involved until the conflict was almost over. And now they were furious that the Americans had come in and taken all of the best islands for themselves. To make things worse, the Japanese were still smarting from their humiliating defeat against the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05. They desperately wanted to modernize their army and navy to rival those of the Western powers, but they couldn't do that without access to raw materials. And that's why they began their invasion of China. There they carved out a special economic zone known as the Japanese Concession of Qingdao or Jiaozhou, where they exploited the local population and resources to fuel their industries back home. But it wasn't enough. The Japanese desired even more colonies in the Pacific, especially those of the Americans. And so they hatched a plan to acquire them. You see, ever since the end of the First World War, the Japanese had been working to improve relations with the Western powers, particularly with the British, who they saw as being the most anti-American of the European nations. In fact, they worked so hard that they managed to convince the British to return Hong Kong to them after the war, which left the British with nothing but Malaya and Singapore. The Japanese thanked them by siding with them in their conflict with the Russians over control of the Turkish Straits. Then, when the Turkish War ended in 1922 and the British found themselves in a diplomatic crisis with the Greeks over the occupation of Smyrna, the Japanese came to their rescue once again by sending troops to occupy the city and forcing the Greeks to withdraw. In doing so, they proved to the British that they were reliable allies. And so the British were willing to listen when the Japanese suggested a plan to annex the American territories in the Pacific. According to this plan, the Japanese would invade and occupy the 3 northern Mariana Islands, while the British would invade and occupy the island of Yap. It was a brilliant strategy that could have worked had it not been for one small detail. The Americans weren't stupid. They knew full well that the Japanese had designs on their Pacific islands, and so they had made preparations to defend them. Sure enough, as soon as the Japanese invaded the Marianas, the Americans sent in troops to stop them. This marked the beginning of the Pacific War, which would culminate in the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. You might think that the Japanese were crazy for attacking the Americans since they had proven to be such powerful enemies. But you have to remember that this was a completely different time. Back then, the Japanese believed that they were invincible. Not only had they beaten the Russians, but they had also successfully invaded China and were carving out their own sphere of influence in East Asia. On top of that, the Japanese had cracked the codes of the Americans and were intercepting their communications. Specifically, they learned that the Americans were preparing to deploy 125,000 troops to defend the Philippines. They also knew that the Americans were planning to evacuate the islands of Guam and the northern Mariana Islands. As a result, they assumed that the Americans weren't willing to fight for these territories and so they could easily be taken by force. As for Pearl Harbor, the Japanese considered this a vital step in their war plan. You see, the Japanese had studied the history of previous wars and realized that the key to victory was striking a decisive blow against your enemy before they are fully prepared to fight. In fact, this was one of the main reasons why they chose to invade the Mariana Islands first, as the U.S. Navy base in Guam was located there. If they could cripple the American Navy in the Pacific, then they would be free to conquer the rest of the region unopposed. And so that's exactly what happened. The Japanese surprise attack destroyed a large portion of the American Pacific Fleet and forced the U.S. to abandon their remaining island territories in the Pacific. In fact, it was only thanks to the bravery of a few hundred Marines holding out at the island of Corregidor that the Japanese didn't manage to capture any American prisoners and gain valuable intelligence on their enemies. After winning this decisive victory, the Japanese became even more confident in their own strength, and even more convinced that the Americans wouldn't resist a full-scale invasion of the rest of their Pacific territories. They demanded that the Americans surrender the Philippines, which the Americans did, along with Guam, the northern Mariana Islands and the island of Yap, which they had been occupying since World War I. Once again, the only reason why the Japanese didn't press their advantage and invade Hawaii was the fear of retaliation from the Americans. For the Japanese, the cost of invading Hawaii and fighting a full-scale war against the Americans simply wasn't worth the benefits of acquiring it. In fact, the Japanese felt that they had already scored a major propaganda victory by taking the Americans' most important Pacific naval base at Pearl Harbor. But as you probably know, the Japanese didn't manage to hold on to any of these territories for long. Within just 2 years, the Americans had built up their forces enough to invade the Philippines and push the Japanese back. By 1945, the Americans had recaptured all of their former territories and the Japanese had been completely defeated. From this point on, the Americans had undisputed control over the Pacific, and they began to focus on building up their presence in the region. This included Hawaii, which was finally granted statehood in 1959. The Americans had good reason for this. As we discussed in our video on why the US controls so many islands, the Americans knew that the next major war would be fought in the Pacific. And so they wanted to be as well positioned as possible. Hawaii was especially important for this as it provided a vital strategic foothold less than 2,000 miles from the Japanese mainland. So that's why Hawaii became the 50th state, not because it was strategically useless, but because it was strategically very important. Although it should be said that at the time, the Americans still hadn't figured out how important it would become in the latter half of the 20th century. If you enjoyed this video, then please hit the like button and subscribe. It's totally free and helps us make more videos that are hopefully educational and entertaining. Thank you so much for watching.